Okay, next up, Bradley finished Pet Cemetery, and he's
Sure
got
did.
some things to say.
Yeah. So let's do a refresher. Um, so to not spoil Pet Cemetery off the bat, like just give me your score about after you've read the whole thing. Like, what's your score?
After I read the whole thing, I'll probably end up with a 3.5 out of 5, which I would like to remind people is like an upper half score on a scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah, I
I don't
I
think it's
would probably
spectacular.
I would probably give it a 4, but I would really think that I would say that it kind of the 4 is mainly gained from the first two parts of the book, and the third part kind
Mhm.
of just happens.
100%. I, I
And yeah,
I really feel like the third part of the book, our climax, is the weakest part, which it's really sad for a climax to be the weakest part.
hmm
Part two, holy shit, was amazing. That's part two is where we get into like the meat of what's going to happen. It starts with, as we said last week, the family member dies, and then a lot of that part is like as soon as part two starts, you know, like what is going to be the climax, like what's
hmm
going to happen. And this is some of the best anticipation building I've ever seen in a book.
Ooh.
Like you know exactly what's going to happen.
yeah,
Um,
the ending of part two, where so let's go ahead and get into spoilers, I
yeah.
guess.
Well,
So
wee woo.
Wee
Woo.
woo, wee woo.
so Gage dies, and Lou decides to go back to the cemetery after sending his family away and sneaking off in the middle of the night, and goes and digs up his son to bury him in the Mimmac graveyard where things come back to life.
Yeah.
And the scene, like right where part two ends, and and like it like where like it talks about like there's a small thing that comes in the room, like opens the bag and pulls out something. It just sends goosebumps up my spine.
The
Just like,
entirety of part two, like I said,
yeah,
it is just like the best anticipation building I've ever seen from the moment Lewis starts deciding he might want to do this, to him deciding he wants to do it, to him formulating the plan, to executing the plan, to walking to the graveyard, to actually doing it. All of that, I was like, holy shit. Like you're just on the edge of your seat or wherever you are while reading this.
mm,
Um, and I don't know, I was just like so hyped. I was like, oh, this is gonna be amazing. Um, but I feel like that anticipation was much scarier than the climax itself, which you
mhm.
would imagine being the scariest part.
Well, a lot of
Yeah,
times I feel like the build up of anticipation is the true horror in a lot of ways.
and I agree with Willer. It's usually the buildup of someone getting stabbed is more terrifying than the actual stabbing itself.
Yeah, it's really strange though. We talked about last time where I feel like the scariest parts of Pet Cemetery, the true horror, is the parts that are real. And just kind of that existential horror of things that might happen or what could happen. Um, Family members dying, um, and kind of the horror about how you might feel about their death. Like, oh, if this person died, would I be fine? And if you think you would be fine, that's a scary thought to have.
Yeah, like
Or,
then you just have this thing of guilt of like, oh, am I a terrible person because I know I'll be okay without this person?
yeah.
Like it's just
And so it's kind of weird because that's what I think the true horror is for most of the book. And the climax, where I think we've already said, okay, this is spoiler territory.
yeah.
You know, Lewis finally buries his son, and his son comes back, and his son is like this demon, like, oh, I'm gonna fucking kill you with a scalpel and all this
Mhm.
stuff, and it feels, I don't know, it feels really weird to me, and it's not as scary as I feel like
Yeah.
it's intended to come off as.
So I kind of liked the what was going on with Gage at the end. So near at the end of the Gage, at the end of at the end of the story, Gage comes back to life and essentially goes on and kills Judd, the neighbor that tells him about the pet cemetery,
Yeah.
Gage's father, and then attempts to kill Lewis. Um, but I like those two things, especially with Judd and Rachel,
Yeah.
the other, because they aren't killed by Gage. They are killed by the guilt of the other person dying.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's very clear that while Gage is talking and doing these actions, it's clear that it's not really him. Like the
yeah,
Gage we knew is gone. This is
yeah,
another entity, Oz the Great and Terrible, as you might
yeah.
say. That it's that like essence within the body that
Mhm.
you see
It
of Gage.
and it's kind of like how, like, your guilt of, like, the metaphor being like the guilt of, or the grief of feeling pain for this person that's already died and passed on, and wanting them to come back can really tear you apart, like literally and
Oh yeah,
figuratively. That's kind of like the point of, because when you have a horror story like this, you have to have some sort of like metaphysical existential reason as to of how that relates back to a person. And that's what that is. It's like, oh god, this person has died. Like, for example, Rachel is attacked by a being that claims it's Zelda through Gage, her sister,
yeah,
and like she talked about how, like, my sister was terrible when she was dying. I'm glad she's dead, and like, even though I feel guilty about it, and so it's kind of like that idea of like it coming back and tearing you apart. That feeling literally killing you on the inside and outside. Um, but I agree with you, Bradley, where it just kind of it didn't really have a very big uh it just wasn't very God, I don't know how to say this. I don't want to say dramatic, but if it didn't fall flat either. It just happened suddenly. That's the best way I can put it. But I will say this is that Pet Cemetery is essentially like is a structured to structured recreation of a Shakespearean tragedy.
yeah. It is a tragedy.
Yeah, in that you have Lewis, who's your kind of like not morally gray, but a person you can see who is a good person. You know they can do good and they set out to do good, but through their own ambitions or personal like fears, they end up making a mistake that ends up destroying themselves or other people that they love. Um,
Yeah,
and you see that when at the beginning, because like Lewis is very much like trying to do the best for his family, has his kids, and then like when Gage dies, he has this personal conflict of like, oh god, what do I do this? It's very Hamlet, where he's indecisive on what he wants to do, you know,
yeah,
and then he finally makes the decision, and it ends up getting him. Ends up getting Judd killed, ends up getting Rachel killed, and probably ends up getting himself killed. Um,
yeah. That's left a little bit ambiguous, but you
Yeah,
can kind of guess.
which is okay. Like it,
Yeah.
that's like you get the point of the story at that point. Once the story has reached its thematic end, it's okay if it ends
Yeah.
like that. I feel.
I think the conclusion part three could have I feel like part two is where the core message and themes of the book are built up the most, and I
Hmm.
don't know if three necessarily sticks the landing on all of them. I think
Yeah,
what it does the best is, like you said, kind of it does stick the landing on guilt and how that can just really destroy someone.
guilt and grief. Yeah,
But as far as some of the questions that the book explores, like whether or not death can be a good thing, or whether or not sometimes death is better. I don't feel like we came back to that at the end
yeah,
necessarily.
I agree, and I think part of that is like, um, one of the things is like, Lewis sends his family away, and right before he sends his family away, he gets in this big fight with his father-in-law over the death
Yeah,
of his son. Like, his father-in-law blames Lewis for this terrible accident for his child, like just a complete dick.
yeah,
Um, but then he immediately, like, not immediately, but a few days later, he calls him up and tries to reconcile the situation and apologizes and says like, "Hey, this is, and it kind of shows that like, and for a long time, him and his father-in-law had this kind of gap between them, and so like when the father-in-law comes back, it's kind of like him putting out that peace bridge, and like really Gage's death is going to be the thing that potentially will drive them to have a more positive relationship,
yeah.
positive things coming from death.
This is a
Um,
thing that I took a big note on, and I kind of reread this part. Because we have two scenes within a chapter or two of each other that are basically flip flops.
Right.
At the funeral, Lewis is like, you know what? I'm gonna extend the olive branch. I'm gonna shake his hand, bury the hatchet. And despite Lewis trying the best he can to, welcome Rachel's father, he is just determined to stay mad at Lewis. He hates him. He says all that horrible stuff. They fight, and then a few chapters later, we kind of have the reverse where Erwin, Rachel's dad, is extending that olive branch, and Lewis is like, no, like I'm like Lewis consciously decides he doesn't want to forgive him. Like he brings up that horrible checkbook incident, for the pure reason that he's like, oh, if I remember this, it's going to keep me mad at him.
Yeah.
And it's just like a really interesting flip flop. Lewis likened, like whenever Erwin apologizes to Lewis, he's like, oh, this is just like what Rachel does. Once they get what they want, then they come and apologize to me. And on one level, since we follow Lewis most of the time, we're like, oh yeah, that's probably what's happening. Erwin, he finally got what he wanted. Now this bastard's apologizing. But I think the reason Lewis thinks this is because he's mad.
He wants justification for his actions at this point.
Like a more positive way to think about it is maybe doing a nice thing makes the other person consider, oh, maybe I haven't been so nice. Like, I don't think Erwin sat around waiting for Lewis to do this, and then he's like, oh, then I can apologize after that. I just think that Lewis did this, and then Erwin is like, oh, you know what? Maybe I've been pretty shitty. But, of course, Lewis can't let go of this grudge, and so he interprets it in the worst possible way.
Yeah. And I agree on that. And he does a really good job of just exploring all the emotions everyone feels during like this grieving process. Like and everyone acts pretty not justified but very human in what they do. Like it's like understandably like this guy just lost his only grandson, and it's just like shit. It's like, of course he's mad, and Lewis just had the shit beat out of him by his father-in-law about something he had no control of. Of course, he still kind of harbors a grudge, and so you kind of have these not weird, but like, you have these conflicting personalities, and like they're never in sync with each other, and like the death just complicates that more.
And so, I guess if we want to talk about a different scene, shortly after that, shortly after all the funeral stuff is settled, we get to what is the most compelling part of the entire book for me. And it's a particular conversation between Lewis and Rachel where he hasn't quite decided whether he actually wants to try to resurrect Gage yet. And he asks Rachel a few questions. He knows that when something survived, it doesn't come back entirely right. It might be kind of dumb. It could be violent. And he's asking Rachel, and probably also asking himself at the same time, would you still love our son if, he never developed a mind past the mind of a 2-year-old? Would you still love him if he was violent, if he grew up doing horrible things? And that's a really hard question, and I'm not a parent, but I imagine if I was, this would be the most horrible, just horrifying part of the book, even just asking yourself this question.
And that's the thing. It's kind of like you have to really think about yourself, because think about it this way of like deep down, like would you really be okay with if God came up to you, like hypothetically, God came up to you and said, like, if you have a child, he is going to be autistic. Like, he is going to be mentally handicapped. He's going to have struggles in schools. He's going to be bullied. Like, are you okay with that? And like, it's kind of like the flipping of, like, if you have a child that there is something wrong with him and makes his life 100 times harder, are you okay with him living that life? Like, would you give him that life? Yeah. Even like, is that a selfish decision? Because then you're in this weird crossroads of like, if I don't have the child, I'm justifiably saying that I'm not giving this child a shitty life, but at the same time, you're not giving him the chance to live. On the
Yeah,
other
it's
hand,
impossible to really know what
yeah,
you would do, and I think that
it,
conflict is like I think that's the most powerful part of the book for me.
and it's and like I remember reading that and like it's just like I like and having that thought process of like I don't know like I don't know if I could like as a personal position like say like it's like well your kid's gonna come out and he's gonna have no legs. I'm like I don't know if like I want my child to have I don't want my child to have no legs, but I don't know if like I could handle like dealing with that my kid has is a not like a little bit behind but substantially behind everyone else in terms of like everything they could possibly do and like and those changes don't aren't small. They completely change a person and how they develop and how they grow and how they live in the society. And I don't know if it's like fair or not to make that decision for that child.
Yeah,
And it's kind of like the book does a really good job of asking you questions of like you know like would you bring your son back if he came back to life and he literally knew everyone's like deepest darkest secrets and would tell them to their face in front of everyone
yeah.
like
Like Lewis knew there was a possibility Gage would come back as just this monster demon thing that he in
Mhm.
fact did come back as, but he still went for it.
Yeah, and like, and another kind of scene that I really liked in the book was Judd explains, like Judd reveals there's actually been one other human being that was brought back to life that he saw, and it was
Yeah,
I forget the guy's name, but he was a soldier that was killed in World War II. I think his name was Timmy,
yeah,
and
Timmy.
yeah, and like and he comes back to life, and he comes back knowing um, everything that every bad deed that people have done and it was kind of a weird like oh god moment that like this idea that our sins aren't just like tied to us, they inflict pain on everyone else kind of deal, and that you like just because you're ignoring them that doesn't mean other people are ignoring them. And it was just kind of a weird thought that there's something watching you and there's people know what's going on, even though you choose to ignore these things. People are aware that you have sins tied to you, you have bad things tied to you. And do you feel like you can live with that? Do you feel like you could live with knowing that someone else knows that you're this sinful?
Yeah, because everything that Timmy reveals about these people and the horrible things they've done,
Mm-hmm.
all these bad things they've done are things that they've done to other people or behind someone else's back who
Mm-hmm.
would be devastated if they knew.
With I think the exception of one guy whose wife who he just told him his wife is just cheating on him.
Yeah.
But I think it's more of like he like I think the point that he was making is like she's doing this, you're just refusing to acknowledge it. Like you're refusing, like you're denying yourself from this reality.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm sure there's a lot more to analyze in that scene, but I can't remember it fully because I think I read it at night.
Yeah, and there's a few more interesting scenes that relatively short. I took some quick notes on them just because or like maybe some subtle things that Stephen King did with words.
Yeah.
That I don't know if there's a whole lot of analysis to go through on them, but I think it'd be a disservice to not mention them. At
Yeah.
least like one thing I really liked that he did in this book is that before Gage's death, characters rarely, if ever, mention looking both ways before crossing a street, even if you can reasonably assume that they do that anyway.
Yeah.
But after Gage dies, every single time a character ever crosses the road for the rest of the story, like it specifically pauses to mention that they looked both ways before crossing the street.
Mhm.
And like, Lewis does it, Rachel does it, Judd does it, and I think that's just a really nice touch. It shows that like it just shows that they learned from this experience, I guess.
Yeah, and like I think too it kind of like um it I think before that, it also sets up this sense of dread, at least for me, because they talk about the trucks going by really fast, and every time someone crosses the street, it sends off this little panic alarm in me.
Oh yeah.
And then whenever they start looking both ways, it kind of lowers that tension down, because I think it's also a way, it not only shows like character development, but also a way of like relaying to the reader that like this isn't going to happen to anybody else, in terms that people have like, people have learned from that, so like I'm not going to get you with that same trick twice.
Yeah. I'm trying to see what else I have here. There was a really interesting bit of foreshadowing I noticed the very first time that Lewis went with Judd to the burial ground and they passed through the quicksand. Lewis is like, "Oh man, I would never take Gage down here because the quicksand is
Yeah.
scary." And epic foreshadowing to when
Yeah.
he takes Gage down to where the quicksand is.
Yeah.
So I thought that was fun. Um, Ooh, another part. I wanted to note this just because Lewis used a very particular way of saying this phrase. Um, Whenever he's going to the graveyard, there's kind of a moment of hesitation where he considers maybe not breaking in and getting Gage.
Mhm.
And specifically, the way he ponders this is in his mind. He's like, would not bringing Gage back from the dead, if I can, would that be killing him a second time?
Mhm.
And the reason I like that phrasing, killing him a second time, is that it reinforces to us that Lewis still holds himself accountable. He thinks he killed Gage
Yeah.
by not being fast enough.
Yeah.
So that was just a good way to just the way Lewis asked that question to himself is really telling, and it also raises a philosophical question for the reader. You know, if you could bring someone back to life with little effort, but you didn't, is that
Yeah.
just as bad or even close to as bad as killing them? Which, that's another question where I don't think anybody can really know the answer.
Yeah. There's one scene that we didn't touch on and I'm not sure there's a lot to like go into it, but
Yeah.
there's one that happens. I can't remember precisely where it happened. I think it happens right before he goes to the graveyard, and it kind of solidifies on what he wants to do. And he's going through this like hypothetical situation, like he goes through all of Gage's life, and like how,
Dude.
or and like how he goes like like he went to high school, he started dating a Catholic girl, he converted to Catholicism, he was on the swim team, and he had a successful life. At one point he and his son um lived at Disney World, and all this kind of like possibilities, and like it reinforcing and like really kind of showing the fact that kind of pushes um Lewis over the edge, and like kind of really hits it hard why Gage's death affected him so much, is that he feels like there's a lost potential for the son that he had, and
God, yeah. And
he
it's
feels
so
so
sad.
guilty that he feels so guilty that his son never got to live up to his full potential in Lewis's mind, even though Gage could grow up to be this fat slob that just ate potato chips all day, but you know but it really hammers home that Lewis like just felt so guilty on the fact that his son died at such a young age and really did not get to live any sort of life at all.
Yeah,
Like he's
and like you
essentially a
said,
blank slate.
or like you were saying earlier, it's that guilt that killed Lewis
Yeah.
in the end.
Mm-hmm. And but yeah, Pet Cemetery asks you a lot of good questions. I give it a 4 out of 5, like I said before. I think it's pretty good. I think it does a great job of like making you think about life, and like appreciating it, and kind of getting more comfortable with the idea of like death is just part of that life cycle. Um, uh, I just wish the ending was a little bit more. I just wish the ending or climax was a little bit more climactic, and I don't need like a big brawl. It's just something. It's just missing one or two things I can't really pinpoint. It just doesn't feel as satisfying as it could be.
It doesn't need to be a climactic brawl. I feel like we didn't have the emotional climax that we were going
that's the
for.
big thing, is we didn't have the emotional part where like where Lewis really gets to see what Gates become. He only sees the aftermath. He doesn't like see it physically or like face to face or anything. Like it's just like Gates, like he never like like faces his mistake. He only faces like the aftermath of it.
Yeah. So there's a million other things we could probably talk about this book. I know we could. I guess for the sake of time, we can wrap it up. I think you said 4 out of 5.
Yeah.
I'll stick with 3.5, maybe 4, probably be higher. If I think the climax was a little bit better, and I know we've already talked about that 3 times.
Yeah.
Pet Sematary, I think the way you described it before was, if someone asked you if it was a good book, you'd say yes. But if they asked you for a book recommendation, this probably isn't the one you'd throw out.
No, not unless I knew that person like really kind of dug that existential or like topics.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, once again, it's not a supernatural horror book; it's an existential horror book.
Yeah, very existential, kind of a thought experiment in some ways. So yeah, I don't know. Pet Sematary, it happened.
Yeah. Next on my reading list, I'm currently reading Bakuman. It's a manga. When I finished it, I'll give my thoughts, or whenever I feel like I want to talk about it.
We are looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about it, in segments if we wanted, but like that's
We'll go in
next
chunks, possibly. It's up to you.
Yeah.
Pet Sematary Part 2 seems really interesting to me, but that Part 3 is.
Well, the thing about Part 3, the good and bad about it is that it's only 40 pages. So
Yeah,
so
it's at the very end of the book.
yeah, it's like literally like, oh, I might as well just finish the book now, and then you finish the book and you're done.
Okay. It's not that bad.
It's not like it's drawn out. It's literally like, and climax go, book's over. There's nothing else to it, which is
just like, as a whole, I gave the book 3.5 out of 5. If I ranked each of the 3 parts individually, part 1 would be like 3 out of 5. Part 2 would be like borderline 5 out of 5, and then part 3 is like 2.5.
And it's not because it was short. It's just because it lacked any kind of like gut punch at the end.
Yeah.
I felt. That's about it.
Well, in that case, Bradley, why don't you send us off with one of your hypotheticals that you never come up with beforehand?
I actually didn't. Okay. Okay. Pick a fruit. Each of you pick a fruit.
Pear.
A pear.
Pineapple.
Pineapple.
Ooh, bad
Okay.
choice. That's going up your ass, bro.
Going up your ass, Joe. There's a guy and he has a gun to your head, and he says, "If you don't stick that up your ass in 30 seconds or less, I'm gonna shoot you."
No, pineapple.
Do you even attempt it, or do you just let him shoot you?
I might as well just let him shoot me.
I picked pear because it's my favorite fruit. It's not the best pick for this, but I guess I could attempt
Like, it kind of has a tapered end. You can kind of.
Does that like fully go in? Like
you have it has to be able to
sustain itself.
Yeah, like it should be able to stay in there.
Okay, I think I can.
Yeah, I think a pear is doable. Pineapple, I'd probably just let him kill me.
Should have fucking picked strawberry or something.
Yeah, strawberry or some shit.
Well, there we go.
There you go. Let us know what fruit you picked in the comments.
Please, we're dying to know. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.